In the German states of the 1700s, Moses Mendelssohn was a celebrated philosopher, the author of a famous book on the immortality of the soul. And every time he passed through a city gate, he paid the toll set for Jews, which was the toll set for pigs. The same country that admired his mind had already, on its toll books, entered him as a pig. This comes from Thomas De Quincey, the English essayist, writing in 1863 about the Germany of 2 or 3 generations before him. You have to understand how those cities worked. A German city in that period was a walled thing with gates, and at the gates stood toll collectors, and the toll collectors worked from a schedule, a list of everything that could enter and what each thing cost: grain, cattle, pigs. And on that schedule, Jews came in under the pigs entry, under the title, in De Quincey's words, of swine, not alongside. Under. A Jewish traveller approaching the gate was, for the purposes of the paperwork, livestock. Now hold the other half. Mendelssohn was not some anonymous traveller. He was famous. His book Phedon, A Defense of the Immortality of the Soul, modelled on Plato, was read all over Europe. The salons, the fashionable evening gatherings of German high society, adored him. De Quincey says they caressed him, and caressed him specifically as an infidel philosopher, an unbeliever, a Jew who, they liked to believe, despised the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, the core of his own scripture. That was the fashionable compliment. They loved him for supposedly rising above being Jewish. So the man who wrote the great book on the soul was, in De Quincey's words, liable to toll as a hog. And here is the thing that stopped me. These 2 facts never collided. The toll collector did not need to know about Phedon. The schedule did not have a column for, unless he is a genius. He passed through the gate, the coin changed hands, the entry was made, and that evening the same man might be the ornament of somebody's drawing room. He even kept attending synagogue, De Quincey says, to save appearances. De Quincey adds one detail I can't shake. By his time, the famous book on immortality had itself died. He says Phedon left its readers quite as mortal as it found them, and then went mortal itself. He'd read about 30 pages of it that way, he says, except for the parts too closely perused by the worms. And through the next century, people crossed an ocean to a country that had no walls, no gates, no toll books. So, did the sorting stop? William Cobbett answers that. Cobbett was an English writer who had lived in America, and in 1829 he published The Emigrant's Guide, Practical Letters for English People About to Sail. And what he tells them is that America had no gate. It had something more thorough. He describes what happened to an English woman when she landed. Every circumstance, he says, even the most minute, concerning the history of her conjugal affairs was quickly sifted out. Her marriage, her past, all of it extracted by her new neighbours, fast. And there was one finding in particular the country would not forgive. A respectable New York boarding house, a house where new arrivals took rooms and ate together at one table, was a serious place. Cobbett wants you to know. Fixed prices, no bowing to fine clothes or heavy purses, and the mistress of the house, the woman who ran it, seated at the head of her own table. That woman would seat no one whose character was suspicious, and she would seat no woman who had been connected, as Cobbett puts it, by anticipation with her own husband. By anticipation, meaning pregnant before the wedding. Married, respectable, years past it. Didn't matter. If the dates didn't line up, the table was closed to her. Cobbett is blunt about the arithmetic behind a closed table. His advice to any couple guilty of what he calls hymeneal haste to the marriage bed, is to get under a roof of their own as fast as possible, become farmers, and keep clear of what he calls women's tongues for a year or 2. Because the women, he says, are piercing, penetrating, disposed to interpretations, ready to draw the disadvantageous conclusion. But he says the suspicion wears out. After a year or 2 of jogging on like any other couple, children born, everything looking usual, curiosity, his phrase, loses its food. Nobody will inquire into the age of the oldest child and compare it with the date of the marriage. Turn that around. In year 1, that is exactly what they were doing. Taking the child's age, taking the wedding date, doing the subtraction. And here's what makes it stranger. This suspicion wasn't a prejudice floating on air. It had paperwork behind it. Cobbett cites a report laid before the House of Commons, the British Parliament. In July of 1828, the parson, the village clergyman of Little Horwood in Buckinghamshire, and a parish overseer, the local officer in charge of the poor from Pelham in Hertfordshire, testified to a committee that among English country brides it was a general thing to be, in their phrase, in a fair way of being mothers, well on the way, before they were married. That report was public. Americans read such things, and Cobbett says they reasoned from it if the practice was general among the English poor, it could hardly be unknown among the English rich, especially since Americans were not in the habit of drawing wide distinctions between rich and poor. So every Englishwoman stepping off every ship carried, invisibly, a parliamentary report about women she had never met, guilty on arrival, by statistics. And she had to live it off, a year or two of blameless breakfasts, until the suspicion quietly starved. So there's no toll book, but you are still entered on a schedule before anyone has met you. What was all this watching for? A charity manual from 1906 answers that, almost in passing. Mary Conington, in a handbook called How to Help, is writing about English labourers newly arrived in America, and she says the first 2 years of such a man's stay are a time of serious danger, not because the work is hard, because of what he left behind. Back home, this man drank beer as a matter of course, like tobacco, like sugar. All his life, no harm done. In America, she says, the climate is different, and the beer is different, both in ways that hurt him. But the deeper thing is this. At home, what kept a man moderate was that everyone knew him. He had, in her words, an established reputation to live up to. Emigration erased it. Among strangers, with no one who knew what kind of man he had always been, the old restraints simply fell away. The man hadn't changed. Nobody knew him anymore. And her prescription is to rebuild what he lost by hand, strengthen his family ties, sustain his self-respect, make him feel, she says, that he has a character to maintain. But a landlady can watch one table, and a neighbourhood one street. Nobody can watch millions. June 26, 1848, Boston. The dedication of the Quincy Grammar School, and Mayor Quincy himself stands up to speak as chairman of what he calls the City Fathers. He's there to defend a number. Boston has spent $200,000 of public money on its public schools, more, he says, than was spent on popular education in the whole of Great Britain, and he tells the crowd why. He describes the child as a being of the most delicate and beautiful structure, carrying a principle capable of unlimited expansion, capable of being fitted to associate with angels and become the friend of God, or, under a wrong bias, of growing into enmity and everlasting misery. The whole community, he says, is in a partnership, and if one of the little partners suffers in character, the whole community suffers in consequence. Each child is a center of widening influence, whose circumference might embrace millions of minds and run through unnumbered centuries. Then he gets specific about the actual boys in the actual building, 400 of them, and nearly half, Quincy believes, are not Americans' immigrant children, many of whose parents, he says flatly, are not fitted for the duties of a republic. And then the promise, these children, educated side by side with American children, will learn self-government and be trained into worthy citizens of the free country. He even suggests the flood of foreigners might be a design of providence, God's own plan, his words, to mix races, elements necessary to give the American character its highest excellence. So, did it work? In 1914, an education professor named William Chandler Bagley sat down with the record 66 years after Quincy's speech, when the children raised in the public schools had grown up and lived whole lives that could be counted. And in his book School Discipline, he reports what the record showed. The second generation of the immigrant population, chiefly from Northern Europe, showed a higher proportion of criminality than the first generation. The generation that passed through the American public schools was, on the whole, less law-abiding than the immigrants themselves. The parents Quincey had called unfit for a republic broke the law less than the children the schools were supposed to remake. And Bagley, a man whose whole career was schools, does not look away from it. Other factors may explain the difference he allows. But the school, he says, can hardly evade responsibility for failing to teach an effective respect for law. He has a suspect in mind. The same era, he notes, saw the most radical transformation of school discipline, the old severity softening, and it came first in exactly the places taking the largest share of the immigrant tide, the big cities. He thinks the lenient methods at school and at home were contributing factors, though he refuses to hang the whole verdict on them. And then, at the bottom of the page, he adds a footnote. Careful, he says. Inferring crime from soft discipline is too ready an inference. It is exactly the inference the ultra-conservatives always make, without evidence. Every generation's conservative, he says, predicts disaster from whatever is new. And to prove it, he produces an American schoolmaster writing in 1837, 11 years before Quincey's speech, before that second generation had even been born, already blaming the new-fashioned laxity of rule for insubordination and riot, even lynch law, mob justice, hangings without trial, spreading through schools and families and whole states, in his words, like a pestilence.